Hi, can you hear me? Welcome to Milo Talks, a new edition where I talk to people on the phone because safety first. My friend Tammy ran a discussion on privilege for her law class. It was so interesting that I asked if I could use it, and this is how it went. Why don't you go ahead and start by explaining what the group conversation was and why you had it?
All right. So I wanted to have a group conversation with a few friends of mine because during this quarantine, my teaching styles have changed. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Southern Mississippi in the Criminal Justice Department. And every semester with my students, I try to have a conversation with them about bias and privilege and other topics. But those are the main ones that I focus on. Well, with us going online this semester, I wasn't able to have that conversation. I did not want it to be me just sitting in front of a computer screen, me, white girl professor, sitting in front of a computer screen talking about privilege and bias. Because honestly, like, how much privilege does that show? And so I wanted to get other people's perspectives. So I decided to get a few of my friends together on a recorded line and have them tell their experience.
Why privilege in a law class?
Well, a lot of my students want to be in law enforcement or attorneys. And both of those are, I guess, categories of businesses or employment where privilege and bias certainly comes into play, whether you're dealing with clients, whether you're dealing with suspects. It could be life or death. We've seen it tons of times. I just want them to recognize that biases exist. And it doesn't make you a bad person. Everyone has biases. But without acknowledging their existence, you can't recognize them when they happen or prevent them from happening in a life or death situation.
Okay. Now, is it part of the college curriculum or is this something you added?
It's just something I added. You just turn on the news and you see things all the time about someone getting shot because they had a cell phone in their hand or nothing in their hand.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you think, hearing stories where my friends get pulled over and they're terrified and have to put their hands out of the window, things that I would never have to think about. Recognizing that the danger that some people just walk around feeling that they are in all the time. And that's not something that I experience. But if you don't know where other people are coming from, you can't really tell where you're going either.
So you picked your friends, and why don't you go ahead and kind of say who they were and how you selected them? Ronnie,
he and I went to law school together a decade and a half ago and have been best friends since. He is a Black male. He has worked in high schools. He has been a football coach. He works with compliance now. He's worked in law firms. He's had a lot of different jobs. And he brought the perspective as a Black man to the panel or to the call. I had Sheila, who is an attorney. She is in South Carolina, also African American. And I thought she would bring an interesting perspective from one being from outside of Mississippi, but still in the South. And she is an employment attorney, an employment lawyer. We're on a women's board together, a national women's lawyer board. And Aboye, we've known each other for a long time also. She does have a law degree, but she does not practice law. She has worked for a civil rights attorney. Her perspective, I think, is a little different because her parents are Nigerian. She has lived in Nigeria. I think there's a difference, which I don't know how much we talked about it, but between having parents who lived in the United States during segregation and integration versus just coming here after all of that. I think her perspective was different or could have been different also. And
right.
do you want me to talk about you?
And then you had me because partially I had the recording equipment.
Because you had the recording system.
I had the ability to record you.
And also because you're biracial. And I think that brings an extra layer to the conversation. And I know I have many African-American students. I have many white students, and I do have several biracial students too. And I think a lot of times they get left out of conversations.
So we're going to go ahead and play the clips of Sheila, Aboye, and Ronnie to how they talked and how they described privilege in our group discussion. This is Sheila.
For me, privilege looks like when a person receives some sort of benefit, whether it's tangible or intangible, that they either know about or don't know that they're receiving. It's conscious or unconscious based on a particular characteristic about themselves.
This is Aboye.
Privilege is like alcohol in a social setting, right? It is a lubricant of sorts that makes it easier for you to navigate life without knowing. I mean, the difference though is that, you ingest alcohol, and so you know that it might make your social interactions a little bit smoother if you're feeling awkward at a party, right? Privilege, like Sheila said, is something that's innate, like it's biological. It's not anything that you can control.
This is Robbie.
A thing that I had to recognize is the privilege of being a male, that I live my life in a completely different way, or we as men live our lives in a completely different way than women have to live their lives, because you have other things to think about, like safety. So it's all these little things that you have to do to make sure you're as safe as possible that I never have to think about it at all, ever. Especially since I'm a large person at that. So I pull in the parking lot and I just park, while I've learned that my wife has parked nearest to the door under the most lit place at all times. And she does all these little things that me as a man, I never have to think about at all.
Right. So there's male privilege, there's able-bodied privilege. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sheila.
Oh, no, I think you were on getting to where I was going. I think a broader term of when you think about privilege that exists is anything that is kind of majority viewed or societally accepted kind of has a strong privilege associated with it. So you can talk about white privilege, but white male privilege kind of trumps general white privilege. Right. Cisgender male privilege. Like there's layers. So whenever you're thinking about what is societally kind of accepted or what's the majority view, if you will, on something, there is a privilege associated with that.
The next clip is Aboye speaking about her brother being what I feel was basically harassment by law enforcement. And just to clarify, I have a history in law enforcement, meaning I was a police officer on the streets. When she was saying this story, and I was like, wait, what just happened? We'll go ahead and play the clip, and then I'll tell you where my mind melted. Okay, are you ready for this?
Yeah, definitely.
My parents lived in Clinton, and my younger brother lived with them for a little bit. And he actually got pulled over in our neighborhood and was given a hard time by a police officer who claimed that he was speeding when he was not, in fact, speeding. Then the officer gave him a difficult time about the way in which he chose to leave the neighborhood based on where my parents' house was. And this was a kid in his early 20s trying to make it to coach his soccer team right around the corner. So he tried to explain to the officer, well, sir, if I'm going this way, I have one less red light that I could hit. And so it actually makes my trip to the soccer field a little faster. The guy gave him a hard time and told him that he was a liar. And, my brother just sent this angry text afterwards. Fortunately, the worst thing he did to the officer was snatch his driver's license back. But he did get berated for snatching his driver's license from the officer's hands. So I got an angry text message from him just cursing about the entire situation. He was shaken up. He went and talked to our parents, and they got really worked up. And on his own, he decided to go to the police station and talk to somebody there about the interaction. Because, I mean, just the whole thing was off. It was unsavory. And so he actually was able to talk to that officer's supervisor, and the officer was new to the force. They ended up reviewing his behavior during the stop and actually put him back on probation because of how he treated my younger brother.
He was asking her brother why he was traveling through the neighborhood in the way he was traveling. He had to explain why he was headed to make the turns he made to go to what was a softball practice, or go to soccer practice. And in my head, right then and there, I went, no way would that be acceptable in any way, shape, or form for an officer to say, well, why'd you go left instead of right if that's what you're doing? When there was nothing happening that would cause an alarm like that, or there's no crime happened that's been reported or called in, and maybe we don't have all that information, but I sincerely doubt it. He just didn't like the answers he was being given.
Mind blowing. All he did was look at her brother and say, you don't belong in this neighborhood, a neighborhood that he grew up in, a neighborhood that he worked in. And the officer decided he did not belong there. And I know I've never had to justify why I went this way to go home, or this way to go to the grocery store, or that way to go anywhere. I may have been asked once, where are you going? But
yes,
never,
that's very common.
Why is this the way you're going? Or
correct.
Are you sure? So yeah, that's mind blowing.
Right. Now I have had to ask probing questions after alarms had been given, meaning driver's license didn't exist. Person's name they gave me didn't belong to the person of the car that it came back registered to. So there would be a reason why I would have probed into someone's, story, because it wasn't making sense. It wasn't adding up. But from what I can tell from what we got, the officer had no reason to do what he did. And I just was, and it may seem small and it may not seem like such a big deal, and he could just answer the questions, but that's really not the point. Those little ripples cause the wave.
The fact that they took steps to get that officer training, or at least said they would, and do other things like that speaks very highly of that department, in my opinion. Of course, the officer did what he did, but they're like, okay, this isn't acceptable. We're not going to tolerate that. Let's get him the training that he needs.
The next clip we go into is Sheila sharing just the fear of standing out when it's not even her that's doing the crime. But because of the color of her skin, she's fearful she'll be blamed.
Very recently, especially with all this quarantine stuff, a lot of people in my neighborhood have been out a lot. And so I was recently walking my dog, and as I was walking down the street, I happened upon a porch where all the houses in my neighborhood have very expansive porches. And there was an older white woman on her porch smoking marijuana. I could smell it. It was in the air. And my first reaction as I'm walking my dog, because I look at the cross street and I see a cop car coming, is that I need to hurry up and get past this house, because should the cop come by, he's going to smell marijuana, and I am going to be the person that he stops to talk to, not this woman on the porch who is openly and notoriously smoking marijuana out in the public. And I am in South Carolina, where that is not legal. So the fact that I have to even think through that scenario as I'm walking my dog down the street is not something that another person a person that is not a person of color is going to have to think about. And so when you are someone that's in a non-privileged situation, you have to think a couple extra steps about what your interactions look like, so you don't find yourself in situations with the police, or you don't find yourself in situations where you're going to be less likely to be believed or treated differently just because of your lack of privilege in that particular scenario.
We brought up the fact that I was biracial, and I shared in the discussion as far as not being accepted in the Black community because I wasn't Black enough. And I didn't learn that until I went to college. I had never had that type of run-in before until I got into that environment. And there was like an African-American club or society that my roommate, who was African-American, had taken me to a meeting. And then I was basically told that I had to pick. I was either Black or white, but it couldn't be both. And honestly, I didn't understand that because I couldn't shed one of my parents off me. That's not real. There's no choosing for me. This is the way I walk. This is where I am. This is how I speak. This is who I am. So for someone to say I have to choose a side makes no sense. But it also, to me, was taking away one of my parents. And who would ever say to you, you have to do that or choose? I was and continue to be very attached to both sides of my family. And they never said I had to choose a side or a favorite. So for strangers who I just met to make that claim on me was really hard for me to understand. And in some ways traumatic, because then I became fearful of Black people not accepting me or liking me just because of the fairness of my skin. I do feel that, like you had mentioned, I pass, which I don't think is a terrible expression. I don't have a feeling attached to it. I can see how it really upsets some people, but I like the idea that I'm not easily identifiable, because when I do travel, it does give me that privilege to be able to walk in any environment and feel moderately okay. And I sometimes find myself being defensive or having to defend myself because somebody said something racist, not thinking anything about me sitting there, that I might be offended by the Black joke because they don't see me as a Black female. So I have to usually remind them, which came later. I was actually embarrassed to do it. I didn't start really standing up for myself until I was well into my 30s. Before it would just make me sick to my stomach, and I would just want to change the conversation or move away from it or just stop dealing with those people, not let them in my life, because I didn't want to have to confront them on their bigotry. And it was easier to avoid it because I was, ashamed, didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to upset anybody. Now, as I get older, I'm like, I would like to think I'm a little bit more defiant, but I do announce it, which is very strange. How many other people have to announce what they are in advance to avoid the inappropriate comments that might come? So as a single female on dating apps, which is also horrific to admit, but I have had to, in the early stages of the courting, texting, whatever, I made it sound nice by saying courting, I have to say, by the way, I'm biracial, so that they have a chance at that point to bow out, or at least to have that information. So if they were to think anything or say anything racist, they would know that that filter needs to be in place. I don't know anybody else who ever has to do something like that in advance. I mean, I'm sure there are, like, right. I'm a vegetarian or I'm a Republican but I have to actually tell people, by the way,
you have to announce that you're half Black so people aren't overtly racist to you.
Yes.
Just saying that out loud, doesn't that make you question, what are we even doing these days?
Yeah, I don't know. But to protect myself and to make myself feel safe in a situation, I have to announce
that. Absolutely. And that is actually privilege and lack thereof, both pulling at each other in the same situation, right?
Which is pretty much how I feel my whole life, walking this walk, right? Yeah. some of my favorite places to be are abroad because they don't know what to think of me. They just see me as foreign, maybe a Canadian. I don't know. So here we'll go into Sheila talking about her experience with having a lighter skin being a Black female.
To build on Milo's story and to add a whole nother layer to kind of this, and you could do a whole other podcast or topic on this, is the levels of privilege within the Black community, because the perception that individuals that are lighter skinned are seen as better, or the fact that they can pass, there is resentment in that. There is privilege in that and the ability to pass. And I am not extremely dark skinned, but I am not extremely fair skinned. And I have consistently throughout my entire life, even though I clearly am Black, I could not pass for white, have been told that I talk like a white person. I laugh like a white person. I've been broken up with by a white person because I wasn't, quote, Black enough. I have had several situations where I have been excluded because I wasn't, quote unquote, Black enough. Now, whether that was my skin tone or mannerisms or how I carry myself, there's even privilege in that situation where people might think that I am prettier or more accomplished or whatever because my skin is not as dark as someone else. So there's even layers upon that in Milo's story. And it's very interesting. I think that we have had similar experiences, even though there's no way anyone could compare me to being white, but we've had similar experiences too. It's fascinating.
Going into this next clip, I think it was probably the most heart-wrenching one for me. Now, you had heard it before. How did it affect you when you heard it for the first time?
The first time I heard it, I think my jaw probably dropped to the ground. It's just not something you expect. I think most of us, when we think of church, we think of a safe space. And when it's not that, or when, I don't want to spoil her story, but
right.
but when a different experience happens other than what you expect, it kind of makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Yeah. Okay, let's go into that.
My family was looking for a church when we moved to Mississippi, and I don't know that we ever thought that race would be an issue in the church, right? And that's one of the privileges that I have, is that I was raised by parents who are not Americans, right? So they didn't live through the civil rights movement, and so they lived through colonization and decolonization, but they have a certain naivety, right? They're just, I'll leave it at that. They have a certain naivety that, the church is a place for followers of Christ to gather. And, we have this one thing in common. We share the same songs sometimes. We read from the same Bible. So we attended a church, and my parents noticed that, people weren't particularly friendly at this one church, but didn't think much of it. There were a couple young couples who spoke to my parents and, just kind of wrote it off. After the service, the pastor was greeting everyone on their way out, and he stopped my parents and asked if they would meet with him in his study after he finished greeting everybody. So we all went back to his study. It was me and my older brother and my parents. And he told my parents during this meeting that he didn't have any issues with our race. However, many members of his congregation did. And so to save his job, he asked that we not return to his church. And so we never returned to that church, although I think my dad ended up going back there many years later for a friend's funeral. But we never went back to that church. And in fact, we took a long break from visiting new churches. And my parents have been at the church that they're at now for almost 30 years. But the former pastor tells a story about being at the office by himself one Monday when this lady with a really thick African accent called, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Do you accept Black people?" And he said that they did. They didn't have any Black people then at the church, but they welcomed Black people. And so she said, well, all right, we may be there on Sunday. So he got off the phone with her, called every one of the elders, and said, hey, there's a family that's going to be here on Sunday, and they have had a terrible experience. So we need to make sure that we make them feel welcome.
So Ronnie had touched on the fact that male privilege, being a man in the world. And then so Sheila brings up the fact that there's actually a law for equal pay. I did not know that. You as an attorney clearly knew that.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think it's a huge misconception. If you ask someone, should people be paid equally? Most people will say, well, I don't even want to say most people, but many people will say that's already happening. It's illegal not to. But I don't think people realize the nuances and how much it's not happening. And so since Sheila is an employment attorney, I wanted her specifically to just kind of clarify that for my students, but for the world, for all of your listeners also.
Yes, all 13 of them. Here's Sheila.
So yes, it's the law that people should be getting paid the same. The problem is that people still aren't. On average, women make about 80 cents to $1, to the same dollar that men earn. And if you were to break that down racially, it is significantly worse. So every year there's this thing called Equal Pay Day, which is the day in the current year that women had to work till to make the same amount that a man made in the previous calendar year. So it's usually around April. So let's call it April 3rd this year. I'm not sure if that's that date. So that would be the time in 2020 that a woman has made the same amount that her counterpart male would have made back in 2019. And when you break that down racially, it's significantly worse. So Equal Pay Day for Asian American women is usually sometime in the summer. For African American women, it's sometime in the fall. For Hispanic women, it's sometime in the late fall, early winter. And a lot of different things go into why women are paid less. It can be things from sometimes companies historically think that women are working just to bring the side money in, that they're not the primary breadwinners. And so it started out with women making less money. Now, what the law says is that people who are working in similarly situated jobs and have similarly situated qualifications and credentials, they should be making the same amount of money. There's a ton of research, and that could be a whole other discussion about other reasons why women may not make as much as men. Things from women are less likely to negotiate salaries where men are. Women are less likely to apply for jobs if they don't believe they're 100% qualified, where a male if a male thinks he has, I think it's something like 40 to 50% of the qualifications, he'll apply for a job, where a woman will only apply if she has 100% of the job. So there's a lot of psychological things, a lot of economic factors, and a lot of societal factors that go into that whole analysis. But the gist of it, to answer all your question and bring it full circle, is yes, it's the law, but no, it's not happening.
Sheila has the final clip, and she talks about, how'd you put it? You do it.
Basically that privilege exists, but a lot of times we don't recognize when it's happening. And I think that's the biggest, that's the gist of her clip, though she said it more eloquently than that.
Privilege is something that a lot of times people don't know they have it, or they don't see it until they're hit with a particular situation. So one of the best things that you could do when you're learning about privilege is to know that it exists and see how it applies in your life and see if there's things that you can do personally to combat it.
In conclusion, do you feel like did you get the end result? You posted this for your class. Did you get any feedback yet?
So I will tell you, I actually posted it to one of my classes and did not make it required for them. And I have it in a module for 3 other sections that hasn't been released yet. That said, the class that was not required to listen to it, and the reason they weren't necessarily required to listen to it is because most of them were my students last semester. So they've done the whole lesson with me. But I did post it for them. And so 3 students have already responded with how awesome it was and how much it opened their eyes and how much it was good to, or how good it was to hear people's perspective.
Right. I don't think, again, it's not about trying to blame society or, point fingers. It's just about shining a light where people get uncomfortable. You said that in our original group that you say privilege and people's hackles go right up, like instantly defensive.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes people nervous. It makes people squirm in their seats. And I think a lot of times it's because they think when you point out privilege, white privilege specifically, they think you're calling them prejudiced or racist. And that's 100% not this. It's just recognizing that you have advantages that you did nothing to earn, where other people were not as lucky as you. And once that's acknowledged, I think you can go through the world and navigate a little easier and maybe be a bit kinder.
And that's really what this is about, right? Just everyone trying to be kind to each other.
Absolutely.
That's the world I want. That's the world that this biracial girl wants.
Harmony, right? World peace.
That's right. I would like the peace, please. All the peace. Thank you so much for doing this. And again, thank you for letting me record our conversations. I always enjoy it.
Thanks for being a part of it. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You can find me at Facebook at Milo Talks, and also you can email me at milotalkstostrangers@gmail.com.